Urban Gateways has been engaging young people in arts experiences to inspire creativity and impact social change since 1961. The following program celebrates the 60th anniversary of Urban Gateways. The Art and Speaker Series highlights the intersection between the arts and thought-provoking topics. Each event will feature compelling artists, some that are part of the Urban Gateways network, and some from outside the reach of the organization. We invite you to sit back and take in some powerful perspectives that we hope will leave you feeling inspired. Special thanks to the sponsors for this event. Thank you, Salmon's Financial Group, Skadden, Werner Co., Deloitte, ITW, Robbins, Salomon and Pat Limited, Eric McKissick and Cheryl Mayberry McKissick. We are grateful for your support.
Hello everybody, this is Justine O'Bevery, and you're tuning in to Art and our topic is Art and Healing. I'm an activist, hip-hop artist, and a participant at Street Level Youth Media. I was born and raised in the north side of Chicago, and Rogers Park is the community that I serve through Circles and Ciphers, an org that I work at. How I entered my field was through a nonprofit organization called Thresholds, a mental health service, help those to get back on their path through an internship. I have two beautiful guests here with me today. First, I will introduce you to Robin Reed Drake.
My name is Robin Reed Drake. I'm a writer, an artist, a teaching artist, living in Chicago, Illinois, but originally from Greensboro, North Carolina. I try to bring in every instance the transformative qualities of art and writing. I moved to Chicago in 2016 to pursue my MFA and really entered into one of the most difficult periods of my life. At the Art Institute, I got to meet a number of incredible people and mentors. One in particular is a poet by the name of Quraish Ali Lansana. He invited me one day in one of our thesis sessions. He said, I'm a teaching artist as well at this elementary school on the west side. Next week, why don't you just come out with me? I'll talk to the teacher. You can shadow me, hang out with the students, and sort of see what this work is all about. And maybe that's something that you would be interested in pursuing. Ever since, I've been teaching artists full-time. As adults, we sort of have this perspective of childhood or our youth is a time where trauma is accrued, and then it's only once we're adults that we're handed the tools to really actually go back and start mining through those experiences and understanding what it is we've actually been through in trying to become who we are. And I just think that doesn't need to be the case. And that, the young people I work with are brilliant and complex and whole, deep beings that with the opportunity, already have the desire to heal and grow in a way that that's going to, contribute to the healing of our world. I think we're setting up a model for for my students to be able to then take that out of the space that we've created together and into their home life and into their communities, and just into their life as they move through the world.
And my second guest is Dr. Dorian C. Miller.
My name is Dr. Dorian Miller. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Chicago, and I'm also the director of the Center for Community Health and Vitality. I have a couple of tracks that I've been pursuing as a part of my life. I've been a physician for more than 30 years at this point, but also, and the reason why I'm participating in this series around arts and healing is because I'm also a playwright. I started writing plays about 11 years ago in response to a request from some of the people that I work with in my role as a doctor working in community health and community research. The topic of the time was the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression in youth, and the impact of community violence. One of our community partners who works with me on the series Community Grand Round said, well, why don't you do a play? And I looked for something that was already written that would reflect the issues and couldn't really find anything that I thought was appropriate. And so I thought I would take a chance and to sit down and wrote the first half of a one-act play. That was the summer of 2010, and that's how my first play, It Should Have Been Me, was started. Over the course of 2 years, the play ran in repertoire for youth between the ages of 10 and 18. Over 60 schools had the opportunity to see the play with audience sizes that ranged between 75 and 100. In each and every audience, over 70% of the youth who saw the play had been directly impacted by violence in their communities in one way or another. However, one of the things that we can see through the use of artistic expression, whether it be a play, whether it be visual arts, whether it be poetry, spoken word, dance, is that it gives young people the opportunity to process the experiences that they've had and to express them in a way that is to some extent at arm's length, but still allows them the opportunity to process these experiences in a more positive way.
Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to start with a healing exercise, a tea healing exercise specifically.
Grab your cup of tea. Let us concentrate. Close your eyes. Concentrate on your breathing. Through your nose, pause. Exhale through your mouth. Let's breathe, and once again, pause. Breathe out. One last time. Breathe. Pause. Blow your intentions into your drink. And with your eyes closed, take a sip. Without spilling, of course. Focus on the sounds around you. Listen to the silence. Welcome those sounds. Recognize the power of silence. And the importance of language. Breathe in. Pause. Exhale.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for doing the tea activity with us. With our special guest, we're going to start off with one question. What does it mean to heal? And understanding your introspectives and perspectives and many more experiences to share. What does healing mean to you?
I love this as an opening question. It's so sky-like. I think I can say that to heal, something I say to myself is that to heal is to know your way home. My practice is mainly in mindfulness and meditation in arts practices, and I recently learned that the Sanskrit for mindfulness in its original Pali language translates to remembrance, and I think that to me has a lot to do with healing, is like remembering, reconnecting, rejoining to a sense of belonging, to a sense of wholeness, that I think things like the traumas that we go through in our day-to-day lives, or sort of capital T, major traumas, can really do the work of severing us from, or convincing us that we're severed from.
For me, as a medical doctor, healing, I think, has a number of dimensions to it, and it depends upon how someone has been harmed. For instance, if you have a cut and you're waiting for the cut to close over and to heal, oftentimes you're returned to wholeness, but it may be a little bit different than before the cut took place, because you may have a scar from it. But I think that the bottom line is the incorporation of whatever experience has taken place. You may not necessarily be where you were before, and I think oftentimes when we think about trauma in particular, whether it be physical trauma or psychological trauma, that oftentimes the life experience doesn't allow us to be in the state before you've had something to happen, but that you end up processing it and you work towards the sense of becoming whole. So I think that that's very resonant with what Robin just said around what does it mean to heal, and what does healing mean?
Those are really beautiful and deep answers to this question, because as an individual, I try my best to figure out, maybe healing is such a vague thing, not a vague process, of course. It's very deep and complex, but it's like, it's more to it. And for me as an individual who goes through like personal counseling and other alternatives for me to heal as an individual and as a person. When you hear the word trauma, what comes to mind?
Usually when I hear the word trauma, I start to think about what type of trauma, because there are different types of trauma. And I also think about a basic definition of trauma, which means that there has been some sort of negative disturbance to one's state of being. And that could be physical state of being, it can be psychological state of being. In these days, it can be economic trauma as well, because of people having problems with losing their jobs, losing their homes. And oftentimes those different types of trauma, whether it be the trauma of poverty, economy, that they can also cause problems in terms of changes in your health and well-being, changes in the way that you think about yourself, changes in relationships with others. And so it depends upon what's been experienced, but also what are the consequences, what's the aftermath, because sometimes it's not just what happens to you, but it's also how you respond to it. And so the first question that you asked, Justine, around the question of healing and the pattern around healing, it's not a yes-no, it's really a journey. And so I think that comes as a part of it.
It ties back to what Dr. Miller had said about when you have a cut, it doesn't mean you're everything that was cut just falls away and disappears, right? It's there and it's going to heal, it's going to look different, but it's still there even when it's in a process of healing. And to your point, Dr. Miller, about not having this yes no sort of black and white binary of healed and traumatized, that's what comes to me when I hear the word trauma, is that big and small, we live trauma every day, and trauma lives in us every day, in our the things we carry on from previous generations, and that healing is really, I think when I say it's knowing your way home, it's the return and the return and the return. It's over and over and over. It's not well, I know my way home, so I'm going home, and that's where I'll be forever, right? That's not the way we live. I think the unfair advantage that falling into those binaries of healed and unhealed, what that puts on us is that we can't heal ourselves, or we can't seek healing or go on a healing journey if we're still traumatized. And that is so not the case, right? Because the world is traumatized, the land we walk on is traumatized, and still we can seek healing.
One of the things that you put into your analogy around trauma and healing and finding your way home actually resonates with me just quite a bit, because there are different paths that one can take in order to come home. And sometimes the path, if you've been traumatized and you have had a certain way to get home, suddenly is no longer available to you, but you're trying to figure out a way in which you can come back to a sense of wholeness and integration in terms of your own sense of well-being, and that you may need to take a different path in order to get home. And so I think that the issue of what constitutes the core of the individual, what makes you you, oftentimes with trauma can change.
I just want to say there are so many multiple truths. It's not linear. Healing and the process of trauma, going through trauma, it's not linear either. Dealing with a lot of factors that people go through in their own life experiences. And I did want to ask you with my next question, what is something that most people misunderstood or don't understand when it comes to trauma and the process of healing?
I can speak to that shortly around what some of the things that people don't realize about trauma is that the impact of trauma, particularly in childhood, can have lifelong consequences. And that trauma can express itself through behaviors that can lead to, unfortunately, not great health outcomes. It's something that's called adverse childhood experiences. Sometimes it's referred to as ACEs. And oftentimes, when we think about that trauma, it can come into manifest itself through various ways, as I mentioned. But experiences like if you have a parent who had serious mental illness when you were a child, if you had a parent who was incarcerated, so someone that has been to prison, if you had a parent that has a substance use disorder, if you are someone that experienced either physical trauma or sexual trauma in childhood, we know by looking at long-term studies of people as adults that it's not just a question of perhaps people having problems with anxiety or depression, but that it affects their lives in other ways, whether it be people drinking too much alcohol, using drugs in order to help to treat that trauma and the pain that they've experienced, but also things like high blood pressure, diabetes, things like people not exercising the way that they should and having problems with their weight. All of these things that can lead to poor health outcomes can oftentimes find their roots back to the trauma that they've experienced that are called adverse childhood experiences.
There is a differentiation between health and wellness, and that wellness, in many ways, that like when I imagine wellness, I imagine justice, and I imagine liberation, and I really think that those are the same thing. And so what I'm, the kind of healing journeys that I'm interested in pursuing myself, pursuing through my creative practice, this moment we're living in is an opportunity to sort of begin to build that future where wellness is possible, where every individual has the means to meet their needs, beyond sort of our maybe current ideas of like health standards, but like or not just health standards, but about around like social resources and individual resources and resiliency and resourcefulness, both like internally as our within ourselves as individuals and between us in our communities.
It's a really interesting perspective, Robin, because one of the things that I'm hearing you say is that wellness is a journey, and that it's not an absolute, that we are all striving towards it, but it's something that we work towards rather than saying I'm here and that I am a perfectly well-being. Yeah, interesting.
We all live in Chicago, and we know that young people can be exposed to gun violence, domestic abuse, sexual assault, substance abuse, and so many other forms of violence. What is an exercise that you can provide to an individual who goes through these things in their life?
One of the programs that I've run for the past 3 summers, along with an alternative spring break, is called WRAP, W-R-A-P, and WRAP stands for the Wellness Resilience Arts Program. And so we include instructors from Urban Gateways that are trauma-informed teaching artists, as well as social work students from the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice, as well as myself and my community engagement coordinator, who is a trained master's in counseling. And we bring in young people between the ages of 13 and 18 for experiences in which they work with trauma-informed teaching artists to develop artistic pieces, whether it be poetry, spoken word, African dance and drumming, or visual arts, around a particular theme that's related to traumatic events that have taken place in the community. Sometimes the prompts are real prompts. Sometimes the prompts are things like movies. And so if you remember the movie and the book, The Hate U Give, we've used that as a artistic prompt. We used the movie Coco, if you're familiar with that movie, that has served as a teaching prompt. So the young people are able to develop their own artistic pieces based on that. When we had showed the movie Coco, our visual artist had the young people to make things called ofrendas, which are altars in dedication to a loved one that has passed away, bringing in little symbols of the various things that they associate with that person as a way to memorialize them. And then we do, at the end of the experience, we have a public showing of either the art, the visual artistic pieces, or the poetry and spoken word. We even had someone to work with young people on developing their own beats as well. And they can invite their family, their friends. We invite people from the university. We offer them a light lunch along with it so people can get a chance to know one another and to talk a little bit about it. COVID's changed things a little bit around that. Unfortunately, we have not had, at least last year, we're not able to do anything in person, but we actually did something online and had young people to use, sadly, the killing of George Floyd as the artistic prompt for the development of protest messages and signs, and then did a public presentation on a Zoom call.
You know, RAP is an incredible program that you facilitate, and I wonder about my role as an individual teaching artist who's not a part of a larger structure, right? That's in place with many individuals trained in the subject to hold that space to process that kind of trauma. But myself as an individual contracting teaching artist who's going in on my own into classroom spaces, I understand that there's no telling who's been touched by this kind of trauma, right? When I think about these sort of high level violent traumas that so many young people in the city are going through, I really have to sort of put on that lens of like harm reduction in the way that I'm stepping into this classroom space, and understand that, like, it's my role in this situation to really like see y'all where you're at and meet you exactly there. But I also think that, one of the ways that trauma affects individuals is a sort of disconnection or a disassociation with our own body and the way that our emotions are carried in our body. And so, something I use often, and I think in response to this question I would use again is, sort of lead a group of students through a guided meditation of like a really simple body scan, sort of calling attention to the crown of the head and like moving, naming our body parts, moving from the crown to the center of the forehead, to the chin, to the heart center, to all the way down to the toes and all the way back up. And do that a couple times to really just like remember that we can feel all of these parts of ourselves, that it's all really connected. And then I writing or visual art, I'll partner with a visual artist so that we're sort of covering all our ground. So it's verbal and visual, and students can sort of pick up what tools they're more interested in. And then ask them to like make a map. Let's imagine what we just explored from the top of our head to the tip of our toe. That's a whole world in and of itself. So how are we going to map that out? Will it look like the CTA map? Will it look like, an ecosystem, a galaxy, and really put words or put images to these feelings, to what it feels like to move through our body, and to bring attention to our whole selves.
So the presence of doing something that is mindfulness based, as I listen to you and as I think about mindfulness practices, I've recommended them for my patients in order to help them with various aspects of their health. In particular, some of the work from John Kabat-Zinn, if you're familiar with his work, because for a couple of reasons. And it's not just a question of quieting the mind and allowing for additional focus, but also being truly physically present in the moment and understanding what you're feeling as opposed to putting it to the outside. Because as you said before, oftentimes with trauma, as opposed to having more of an integrative approach, people tend to put things in boxes and they say, I'm not dealing with this here because it's over there. Yeah. And I see this as a doctor in many ways. I have had patients to come in who have said, my head hurts all the time, my stomach hurts all the time. And as I start to talk a little bit more about not what they think is wrong with them, but what happened to you, and I will have people to report, I was a victim of this. I was a victim of that gunshot wound, sexual violence, whatever it happens to be. But because they lack that integrated approach that Robin just talked about, they are unable to make a connection between what they're feeling and what happened to them. And so being able to bring those two things together, for me as a clinician, it opens up a door in terms of how I might say, yes, these things happen to you, and let's think about how this might be affecting your ability to deal with chronic pain. You're drinking too much, the headaches that you're having, other things that are manifesting themselves as physical symptoms that really have their origins in the dissociation of that trauma, whether it be more recent trauma, and for some people, more of those adverse childhood experiences that we talked about before.
There really is no separation, right? That what's happening to us emotionally, psychologically, is happening to us physically. And I think maybe this is rolling back a little bit to an earlier question of a common misunderstanding around trauma, but that, which is that, that work of healing is like literally transformational, like literally building new synaptic pathways in our brains, like training our brain to biologically change itself. And that takes time and dedication and repetition, and yeah, it's just wonderful to hear your perspective from as a medical physician in those kind of integrative practices. Something that came up for me when we were listening is a very silly meditation that I like to do, just because it's short and quick and it kind of gets to the point, but from Mingyur Rinpoche, who's like a very well-known meditation teacher, Tibetan Buddhist. It's called pizza meditation. Have y'all heard of this? Could we do it? Yeah. It's super quick. I don't know if anybody has a timer on them, but I could count in my head. So the point of pizza meditation is that you're just going to meditate for a minute. And you can think about anything you want, but not pizza. No pizza. You're not allowed to think about pizza at all. Not even allowed to think about a pizza place. Not about eating pizza, smelling pizza, making pizza. For 1 minute, don't think about it. Okay? Okay. So we'll meditate for a minute. Remember, no pizza. Okay, that's maybe been about a minute. So did you think about pizza?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I did. You kept saying pizza, pizza, pizza. I said, how can I?
Not think about it.
Right. So this is like the point of pizza meditation, right? Which is kind of to what you were talking about, compartmentalizing these thoughts. That when we're trying to push something away, when we're trying to control our mind, of course you can't do it. Like, it's gonna, whatever you're trying to not think about, like, you're gonna think about it. It's gonna come back. And so, I use this as a way to talk with young people about meditation and sort of relieve some of those myths around, like, oh, it's all about like being quiet and calm and focused and it's like actually the opposite. It's about letting it all be what it's gonna be and flow and like think about pizza, and then remember to not think about pizza, and then think about it again, and then remember to not think about it. I don't know.
There is no secret that the year 2020 took a toll on all of us. How are you healing after the pandemic?
Oh boy, this has been the year and a half of all I never would have imagined in my wildest dreams or nightmares that I would have a year like this. But it, as the expression goes, it is what it is. And I think that one of the things that I have had to learn over the past year and a half is a lot like, if you've heard of the Serenity Prayer, courage, wisdom, and acceptance. And sometimes being courageous has been being able to, knowing that there, as a doctor, there was a lot of COVID-19 circulating, but that I needed to go in and to do what I needed to do to treat my patients, knowing that there was an unknown that was there. And so that's been about that. It's interesting that you talked about your mindfulness practice, because I started a regular mindfulness practice probably about 6 months before the pandemic hit, and which was exactly great timing. And I thought, but right before the pandemic hit, that I wouldn't continue it, but the teacher offered an ongoing course, and I decided to take it. And I have to say that it's probably one of the best parts of my week. There have been losses along the way. I unfortunately have had some patients that have passed away from complications of COVID-19, and not people in their 70s and 80s. I've had 30-year-olds that have passed away, unfortunately, from complications of COVID-19 infection. And so being able to integrate this into, this is a part of what takes place when something like this happens, and to move along with it.
As a teaching artist working with young people throughout the pandemic, I have found, that working online, of course, brings its own enormous set of struggles around engagement. But it's also been an incredible opportunity to really engage almost more directly with young people in programming, and just having that outlet for myself when I, was staying home like everybody else, but I knew that multiple times throughout the day I got to walk into these rooms, sometimes full of faces on screens, a lot of times blank screens with mics on and off and chat boxes, but that I was able to find, not just find community, but just like be with people, be in process with people, be really honest and really real about how much it sucked, and like, all of the ways that they were, struggling to just do the day-to-day schoolwork, and then getting to be that sort of exception in their day where, okay, well, now we're going to do some art and be creative and sort of approach all these things that maybe you can't talk about in the rest of your day because you've got math lessons or like, Spanish lessons or whatever. The, in being tasked with holding that space for other people, I've been super tasked to hold it for myself right outside of that. So really seeing that mindfulness practice like deepen and widen way further than I imagined it could before the pandemic, and really plugging into the ways that that these practices for myself are very much connected to the other things that have been going on throughout this same year, right? These other pandemics of white supremacy and, and the police, and, really using the tools that I have been equipped with through these other mindfulness practices to ask these questions of myself in this context as well. One of the best books that I picked up over the pandemic is by Resmaa Menakem, called My Grandmother's Hands. I couldn't recommend it more to every person on this planet when it comes to healing from racialized trauma. White people, BIPOC people, it is a truly transformative text. There's one practice in particular that I think has been incredibly helpful for me as a writer, that Resmaa Menakem writes about in My Grandmother's Hands. Think about that moment when an ancestor became white. Maybe you know exactly who that is. I have the privilege of having a sort of armchair historian in the family, so I literally called up my uncle and said, all right, can we like sit down and go through this history? And so the writing exercise is to write that moment. Imagine the moment, even if you don't know your ancestor, even if you can't like actually place it in public record or on a map, but imagine that moment where something changed. That's been incredibly fruitful for me as a writer, to really like dive into that world, imagine that moment, and understand a progression of things and how I, in my body today, am able to move through the world.
Thank you to the both of you for the fruitful discussions. I really resonate with everything, and this conversation had given me. And I want to ask you one last question, which is, before we end, what are you currently working on? And also, do you have any events coming up?
So actually this week, starting on Monday, we started our RAP program for young people between 13 and 18, the one that I described a little bit earlier. We are not doing the program with African dance and drumming, but we're actually doing more of an integrative program with visual arts and poetry and spoken word. And on Friday, we will have our capstone that's done over Zoom, in which young people will be able to not only see each other's work because they've been working in small groups over the week, but also to present that work publicly. I am hoping for days in which we are able to gather in the same physical space again to do this work, because in spite of all of the wonderful things that technology has lent to us over this period of time, I'm sorry, but there's just being able to talk to someone across the table and being next to them, to communicate and to share. I think that there's just nothing like it, and so hoping for that to take place the next time that we run the program. In addition, the Community Grand Rounds program that I mentioned a little while ago, that is more along the lines of community education, will get started with our 12th season of Community Grand Rounds coming in November, and so we're in the midst of planning for that as well.
I'm working in my programs this summer and in getting everything lined up for myself for the school year ahead. Actually, in not that long from now, August 18th, I will be reading alongside some other incredible queer and trans writers at the Center on Halsted as part of Foglifter Press's Home is Where You Queer Your Heart. They're taking on a national book tour. And then later in November, I'm actually working with the folks through the Exhibit B reading series which is sponsored by the Guild Literary Complex, to curate another event, queer and trans literary event. And I'm really excited about that one. It's a little far off, and we're still in the planning stages, so I won't give anything away, but I'll just say I'm not a fan of like a normal poetry reading. So we're hoping this one will be anything but normal.
I want to thank both of my guests, Robin and Dr. Miller. Thank you guys so much for tuning in into Art and Healing. You can catch our next segment in October, Art and Change Making. Thank you all so much and have a good evening.
Special thanks to the sponsors for this event. Thank you: Salmon's Financial Group, Skadden, Wernico, Deloitte, ITW, Robin, Salomon and Pat Limited, Eric McKissick and Cheryl Mayberry McKissick. We are grateful for your support.